Hello, welcome to Tech News Curator. I'm Julian Ho. 2023 is now in its fourth quarter, and promotional periods in mainland China will start. As we enter December, the traditional holiday shopping season will begin in Europe and the US. However, it's been a very strange year. We can see that apart from the uncertainty in the consumer market, the trade war between the US and China hasn't eased. We've got the key weekly highlights from Tech Scrapbook, the must-see industry news from the tech industry. First of all, Samsung, Taiwan's biggest competitor in the tech industry, released its latest flagship SoC chip, the Exynos 2400, this week. In fact, after a year of silence, Samsung has returned to the cell phone chip market, and this chip is confirmed to be in the Galaxy S24 series. It also means that the American IC design leader, Qualcomm, won't be able to get all the Galaxy S24 orders by 2023. Let's see what the industry has to say about the impact of this on first-tier cell phone processor design companies such as Qualcomm and MediaTek. So far, although Samsung has made the first move, MediaTek and Qualcomm won't make any major strategic adjustments for the time being. This is mainly due to the fact that the two major players are so confident in their own products. Even if Samsung declares to return to the cell phone chip market, it is still difficult to shake the current stage of the cell phone SoC landscape. Professional reviewers are moving quickly. It's been rumored that an engineering unit of the Galaxy S24 with this Samsung chip has been obtained and tested for performance, and we've seen that the GPU scores have been very good. The Exynos 2400 is still slightly behind Qualcomm's Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 project, although it's just a reference and a single score. It can't present Samsung's overall performance, but this Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 is actually the reference standard for flagship SoCs in 2022. Samsung's real challenge should be Qualcomm's Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, which we've seen so far is not enough to justify a comeback on the other hand. As we can see, the Exynos 2400 actually uses Samsung's own 4nm process for wafer fabrication, and this 4nm process is actually a bit worrisome for consumers. After all, both Qualcomm and Samsung have had serious heat problems in the past due to Samsung's own production process. Qualcomm has even switched its investment to TSMC, and this time the Exynos 2400 is not only responsible for Samsung's revitalization. Whether or not Samsung's foundry manufacturing technology has improved is also a major concern for the outside world, and from the details available so far, there are some doubts about whether the Exynos 2400 can compare with Qualcomm and MediaTek's flagship product this year in terms of performance and power consumption. This is one of the reasons why Qualcomm and MediaTek are relatively calm. Let's see, from Qualcomm's point of view, although the proportion of shipments to Samsung may become smaller. There's some direct impact on operational performance, but if you look at the difference between the Exynos 2400 and the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, you'll see that the Exynos 2400 is a very good match. It won't affect the brand status of Qualcomm SoCs, and consumers will still consider the Galaxy S24 with Qualcomm chips as a real Samsung flagship phone. Qualcomm still has a strong foothold in the flagship cell phone SoC market, so let's look at what MediaTek has to say from MediaTek's perspective. In fact, Samsung's flagship mobile phone is not MediaTek's home court, and the Exynos series chips are not favored by Chinese cell phone brands. Now that Samsung's chip line is just starting up again, it's definitely going to be imported into Samsung's own cell phone line. Therefore, we can see that MediaTek will not be impacted by Samsung's return to cell phones. But Samsung's idea of conquering mid-range and high-end models may be more difficult to realize. In fact, cell phone SoC industry insiders say that for Samsung, it's always wanted to catch up with Apple. However, it has not been able to achieve the same system-level advantages as Apple, mainly because it has not been able to keep up with the leading groups in terms of design and manufacturing capabilities. If the problem is not completely solved, it will be difficult to catch up with Qualcomm and MediaTek, not to mention Apple, which has already entered the 3nm field. This is a bigger challenge for Samsung. We see Samsung as a major competitor of the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturers. Samsung is one of the competitors of Taiwan manufacturers, including panel displays. Let's look at one of Samsung's competitors, AUO, a major Taiwanese panel maker. They're now embarking on a transformation process after they bought this big German company, BHTC. And how do we analyze that going forward in this recession? AUO has launched an international M&A strategy, splashing 600 million euros to acquire BHTC. But people are asking whether AUO has paid too much for the acquisition. DIGITIMES research believes that AUO's acquisition of BHTC is of strategic significance, and this strategy will deepen AUO's future development in the automotive industry. So a 600 million euro acquisition is within reason. What do you think? BHTC is an international first-tier player, and there are three perspectives as AUO's acquisition of BHTC has strategic advantages, including firstly, a more complete global presence, And secondly, the ability to expand the system design capability of the smart cabin. Thirdly, to increase the number of customers. Firstly, the advantage of the global distribution of production bases. In fact, we can see that the automobile industry actually emphasizes on localization of production. The global layout and supply stability of the automobile industry are related to tariffs and national policies, so the location and number of factories are very important. We can see that most of AUO's production bases are on both sides of the Taiwan Straits, Taiwan and China, and there are already 2 overseas factories in Slovakia and Singapore in Eastern Europe. BHTC is actually based in Germany, Bulgaria, the United States, Mexico, Japan, China, India, and so on. Most of these places are also major production centers for the automotive industry. For example, BHTC is actually headquartered in Germany, and Germany is, of course, the leading automotive country. Our first-tier car makers include the ones we've heard so much about, such as Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and so on, as well as the world's top 10 automotive component first-tier companies. Bosch, Continental, and many others are well-known companies. So let's look at the Americas and see where BHTC is located, including the center of the U.S. automotive industry in Farmington Hills, Michigan, which is actually close to major U.S. car manufacturers, including the headquarters of GM and Ford. BHTC's production facilities in Mexico are home to many well-known traditional car manufacturers, including Toyota, Mazda, Honda, Fuchs in Europe, GM in the U.S., and many others. Let's look at the potential markets. India. BHTC's production is based in Pune, Maharashtra, India, known as the Oxford of the East. There are many automobile-related universities and companies in this city, including Tata Motors, Mahindra, Mercedes, Fuchs, General Motors, Ford, and so on, as you can see from these 3 examples. With the acquisition of BHTC, AUO will have a more advanced global presence and an ecosystem for the automotive supply industry. Well, actually, the market, they're going to keep asking, okay, well, even if it is, AUO's purchase price of 600 million euros is not too high. We can have some examples to make some comparisons if we compare EMS like Quanta. Quanta went to Mexico to set up a factory. The initial investment was as much as $500 million. And then we see that Hong Hai bought this Ohio factory in the US, although the investment was not that high. But it's still 230 million. So AUO can just use this acquisition strategy for global deployment purposes. This amount of 600 million euros should have been cautiously evaluated and considered. If we look at the product line, the BHTC is actually helping AUO to expand the intelligent cabin system design for future vehicles. In fact, the human-machine interface overlaps with AUO, but the air conditioning system of this vehicle is completely new to AUO, and this air conditioning is in the intelligent cockpit. In fact, it plays a very important role because the air conditioner must give the driver the most comfortable feeling according to the external environment. It also indirectly improves driving safety, and besides that, air conditioning is one of the most energy-intensive systems in a vehicle, consuming about 10% of the total energy. It varies greatly with geography. One of BHTC's strengths is electronic power control components for air conditioning. The purpose is to reduce the noise of the air conditioning system and increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the air conditioning system, which in turn extends the range of the electric vehicle. If we look at the customer side, we know that the traditional automotive supply chain is actually quite closed. So in fact, AUO is a tier 2 supplier. Sometimes it's a tier 1.5 supplier, and it depends on how it's negotiating its relationship with the car manufacturers. But if it can work directly with a tier 1 manufacturer that knows the operation of the depot, such as this BHTC's lead, AUO can really upgrade to become a real tier 1 supplier and start to have a common language with the car makers to understand the car makers' thinking. It's easier to develop and design the next products. In fact, among the top 10 car manufacturers in the world, 7 to 8 of them are AUO's customers. But let's take a look at the number of BHTC's automobile customers, which is nearly 40, with Europe being the largest, including Volkswagen, Audi, Bentley, Mercedes, BMW, Volvo, Porsche, Renault Mini, Porsche Citroën, Skoda, Seat Bugatti, the French supercar manufacturer, Romanian car manufacturer Dacia, Dutch manufacturer Duffy Commercial Vehicles MAN, Swedish commercial vehicle manufacturer Scania, and so on. US customers include GM, Chrysler, truck manufacturer Freightliner, commercial vehicle manufacturer Navistar, and truck manufacturer Packard. Chinese customers include FAW Volkswagen, SAIC, Shanghai General Motors, SAIC, Volkswagen Smart, etc. Indian customers are local automobile manufacturers, including Tata, Mahindra, Renault, Japanese car makers, including Nissan, etc. So we can see that the customer base of BHTC is not only broad, but in fact, apart from general passenger cars, including premium car makers, second-tier car makers, commercial car makers, etc., which AUO has little contact with, so the merger will expand AUO's scope of car maker customers. Therefore, we still believe that AUO's acquisition of BHTC has a very strong strategic significance. Through this, BHTC acquisition can enhance AUO's competitiveness in the automotive industry, and AUO has been upgraded from a Tier 1 supplier to a Tier 2 supplier, expanding our customer base. It can play a more important role in the global automotive industry chain, and this is actually the strategic direction that we observe in AUO's acquisition of BHTC. Okay, so we've just finished talking about the promising future vehicle sector, so let's take a look at the 3C sector, which has been more challenging this year, and let's take a look at some of the lighter news. When we look at the home console market, we see that Sony PS5's competitor, Microsoft Xbox, actually just broke the news about Sony PS5. The Xbox is in the middle of a lawsuit that's a direct revelation of a next step for the Sony PS5. So Sony did release a slimmer version of the PS5 that was completely outclassed by its competitors. Sony expects to start selling the revamped PS5 on November 10th of this year, focusing on lightweight and compactness. The capacity of the built-in SSD can be expanded to 1 TB, etc. In fact, most of the components and suppliers have not changed much. We can see that some of TG Taiwan semiconductor companies, TSMC, ASE, and others are still producing chips for AMD, which is the main supplier of customized chips for the new PS5. In terms of back-end orders, we are sharing the orders with the Chinese packaging and testing company, Nantong Fujitsu Microelectronics, and we can see that the demand for gaming machine chips has maintained a relatively stable trend. In fact, when we analyze the 3C electronics end market this year, there's no clear sign of recovery in the consumer electronics market, including cell phones, PCs, TVs, etc. The main reason is that the spending power of the general public has been affected by the sluggishness of the economy as a whole, although there is a peak season compared to the epidemic period when the epidemic was in full swing. In fact, demand is still way down, and we generally expect to see a gradual recovery after the first half of 2024. So let's take a look at that. In fact, during the time of the epidemic, there was a shortage of many basic IC packaging materials. It's been a high level of demand for Sony PS5. As the epidemic has subsided, the shortage of material has eased significantly. Sony officially announced in the middle to end of July 2023 that its PS5 has officially reached 40 million units sold. The market speculation says that it's roughly double the volume of Microsoft Xbox Series XS combined in the same period. Sony's next strategy is to launch this slimmer and lighter model, which is expected to go on sale on November 10th of this year. The main idea is that it's going to be 30% smaller than the old early PS5, and the standard version with the CD-ROM, it's going to be about 18% lighter. The digital models without the optical drive are about 24% lighter and cost $449.99. What do we think of Sony's sales strategy? In fact, Sony is saying that if the old PS5 inventory is sold out, it will stop selling it. And that's what will happen with the new, slightly revised model. Sony is still aiming to sell 25 million PS5 units in this fiscal year, from April 2023 to March of the following year. So what if they can reach that goal? The annual growth rate of sales is over 30%, so what's the significance of this? Actually, we can see that for the testing industry, which emphasizes on chip capacity, if there is a high growth rate, we will be able to achieve a high growth rate of sales. Of course, it's a good trend, but in fact, back to the game machine industry, the game machine industry is relatively mature and fixed in terms of the chip processor. In fact, the volume of energy is also relatively fixed and will not grow too much, but the demand is relatively stable, mainly following the traditional seasonal fluctuations. But the ups and downs aren't as dramatic as in the cell phone market. And if we look at it from a chip manufacturing perspective, this is actually a much larger chip for gaming. In fact, this is a node of its own, as radical as cell phone chips. And we've seen that the mainstream should be the 7nm and 6nm generations. Whether or not it's going to cross over to the next generation of 5 nanometers, it's estimated that we still have to observe the status of this next generation gaming machine, and the relevant industry has already speculated that in fact, Sony is currently selling. In this situation, it's possible that the Pro model that everyone has been speculating about for so long may not be released in 2024, and even people have been speculating about that. But in fact, both Microsoft and Sony have It may take until 2027 before there will be a noticeable upgrade in the performance of the console and the processor chip. These speculations have not been officially confirmed. We are all in the speculation stage. But how is the market estimated? Actually, as we can see, the supply chain for semiconductors is pretty much fixed, like TSMC in the front and ASE in the back. Honghai, EMS, is still the main supplier of the new PS5, and other Taiwanese companies, such as peripheral chip makers Ziltech and Phison, are still the main suppliers of the new PS5. Ampec has also entered the supply system of gaming grips, fan drives, power supply chips, memory controller chips, and so on, as well as the carrier boards of Unimicron. Nanya PCB, PCB's Handstar board, power supply giant Delta, etc., are also in the supply chain for the new PS5, and we can see that the testing industry is actually saying the same thing. In fact, this console market is a relatively mature market, and the clientele is relatively stable, so the replacement cycle is usually about 5 to 7 years. if we look at the overall consumer electronics market this year, it's still a bit of a challenge for you to expect a big growth. In fact, it can be maintained at a certain level of stability compared to the cell phone or PC supply chain. There is actually a certain degree of certainty. In fact, in the overall 3C market, there are still a few areas that are relatively healthy. That's all in this episode of TechCrunch. Thank you for watching. The English version of Tech News Curator will be broadcast every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Feel free to like, subscribe, and enable notifications to receive our updates in real time. We'll see you next week.